Hello, I'm Rod Dreher, and welcome to Conversations with Metropolitan Hilarion. Vladika, now we were talking about the Gospels in our last conversation. We have 4 lives of Jesus in the Gospels. What are the most important ways that they differ and the most important ways that they are alike?
The 3 first Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called synoptic, and this is the Greek word which basically indicates that there is some common material. And there is actually quite a lot of common material, which indicates that it is very likely that there might have been some common source. Whether this common source was oral or written, this has been a matter of dispute for a couple of centuries already. Now, each gospel has its own characteristic traits. For example, the Gospel of Matthew, it is based on the principle of inclusion of several long speeches of Jesus. Altogether, there are 5 speeches, and you have narrative, then you have a speech, then you have narrative, then you have a speech. And each new turn is marked by the author saying when Jesus finished his words. And the last long speech finishes with the words when Jesus finished all his words. So it is a literary form which allows the evangelist to present not only the life of Jesus, his miracles, but also his teaching in a coherent way. Mark is different. He doesn't have these long speeches, and he puts emphasis more on miracles. Luke is different too, because he was obviously writing after the others, and he refers to them indirectly, though, when he opening his gospel is saying that in the way that many have already started to write about Jesus, so I present to you, and then he mentions the addressee, a certain Theophilus, the life and the teaching of Jesus Christ. He also puts emphasis on some aspects of Jesus' ministry, which may have been somewhat overlooked by other evangelists. For example, he gives more place to the women. Then comes John, who is very different.
Very different.
And he obviously was writing after the 3 evangelists. He knew their stories, and I think his major idea was to complement their stories, to add the missing material, and also at some points to correct what he believed they presented not in an accurate way. For example, the whole dispute about when the crucifixion occurred, on Easter or before Easter. And the difference is here between John and the other evangelists, and it seems that John wanted to be more precise than they by indicating even the exact hour when it was happening.
So that's really interesting. You have 4 different accounts. They have some overlap. They have some differences. What are the interpretive problems that poses, that you have different voices?
Well, first of all, some would say that if there are discrepancies or disagreements between the evangelists, then something must be wrong. I would rather say that this confirms the trustworthiness of these accounts, because if they would coincide even textually 100%, this would mean that they not only used the common sources as they did, but that they somehow were in agreement with one another, and they corrected each other.
So they got their story straight.
Yes, which was not the case. So they agree in principle, they agree in all major things, but they may disagree in some details. Then, of course, John is very different from the other three because he stresses the divinity of Christ. From the very beginning till the very end, he stresses that Jesus Christ was God incarnate. And he begins his gospel not in a usual way. He begins it with a solemn proclamation that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So he begins with the statement that the subject of his account was actually God. And he finishes with the same. When Thomas venerates Jesus, he says, "My Lord and my God." So this stress on the divinity of Christ is a very strong point, which he makes from the very beginning to the very end. And all the stories which he picked to tell us are, in fact, illustrations of this point that Jesus Christ was God.
May I ask you, which of the Gospels is your personal favorite and why?
Well, I like all of them, of course. Probably my personal favorite is the Gospel of John, and it has for me some sort of autobiographic overtone, because when I served in the Soviet army and it was impossible to keep a copy of the Gospel either in a pocket or in some other place, I borrowed a very small Gospel from a friend, and I learned by heart the Gospel of John because I liked it more than the other three, and also because it is easier to memorize. I also used it as a tool to learn languages. This is how I usually started to learn a language, be it Greek or English. I started to read the Gospel of John, and here you can have many words which are used repeatedly. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, etc. So you have a very good tool not only to understand Christian theology, but also to learn a language. And then, of course, it's a fascinating account of Jesus Christ's life because it presents his life from a very different angle than the other three Gospels. In particular, almost all the events described in this Gospel take place in Jerusalem or near Jerusalem, while the other evangelists, they put more stress on Jesus' service in Galilee. There is even a theory that John was some sort of secret disciple of Jesus who didn't accompany him on his other journeys, but who met him whenever he came to Jerusalem. And this is why he stresses these three comings of Jesus to Jerusalem.
What do you think of the theory that one of the Gospels, I believe it was Mark, was really dictated by Peter?
Well, it's very likely that it may have been dictated by Peter. This is, in fact, the information which comes from the early tradition, I think from Origen, or certainly from Eusebius of Caesarea. And it was believed that both Luke and Mark were disciples of Peter, and in fact, Mark is mentioned in one of the Peter's epistles. But also he is mentioned by Paul, and it is clear that he was also the disciple of Paul. Neither Mark nor Luke were the apostles from the 12. According to the tradition, Luke was one of the 70 apostles, and Mark was probably the disciple of both Peter and Paul. Then there is the theory according to which the Gospel of Mark was the first to appear, and that Matthew and Luke used Mark and the other unknown source, which I mentioned in one of our previous conversations, which is called the Q source, which apparently never existed. But this theory of the primacy of Mark has some strong points, but also some weak points. So I personally am not at all convinced that it was necessarily Mark who was the first.
Metropolitan Hilarion, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us.